The terror you're feeling right now isn't a signal that you're about to fail. It's the sensation of your old self losing its grip on the wheel. And nobody warned you that transformation would feel exactly like coming apart, because if they had, you might have refused the whole thing. So instead, you're standing in the dark, convinced you've lost the plot of your own life, when what's actually happening is that the plot is being rewritten from underneath you by a part of yourself you've never met. Here's what makes it so disorienting. You expected growth to feel like climbing. Like each day you'd wake up a little stronger, a little clearer, moving steadily towards some better version of yourself. Instead, it feels like descending, like the floor keeps dropping, like every certainty you built your identity on is turning out to be a prop, and the stage is being disassembled while you're still standing on it. Carl Jung understood this stretch of the human experience more intimately than almost anyone who ever studied the mind. And part of the reason is that he didn't merely observe it in the people who came to him for help. He went through it himself. In 1913, at the height of his professional success, Jung entered a period of psychological descent so profound that he genuinely wondered whether he was losing his mind. He heard voices. He saw visions. He felt the ground of his own sanity turning to water beneath him. And what he found at the bottom of that descent became the foundation for everything he later taught about how human beings actually change. He came to understand that there's a specific phase every genuine transformation passes through, and it's the phase almost nobody talks about because it looks like the opposite of progress. It looks like breakdown. It feels like the end. And that appearance is so convincing that most people turn back right at the threshold of the very thing they've been aching for their entire lives. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about this terrifying phase, why it feels like dying, what's actually being dismantled inside you when it happens, the specific terrors that surface right before a breakthrough, and what each one is really telling you, and why the darkness you're standing in isn't a sign you've gone wrong. Because if your life feels like it's unraveling in ways you can't explain to anyone around you, there's a real chance you're not breaking down at all. You're standing in a dark room, and your eyes simply haven't adjusted yet. That's the first thing to understand about this phase. When you walk into a dark room, there's a moment of total blindness, a stretch where you'd swear there's nothing there, no shapes, no way through, just black in every direction. And if you panicked in that moment, if you turned and bolted back toward the door you came in, you'd never discover that the room was full of things you needed. The blindness isn't permanent, it's the eyes adjusting. But the adjustment takes longer than panic can tolerate, and that gap between the darkness arriving and your vision catching up is exactly where most people lose the transformation that was trying to happen to them. Let me describe what this phase actually feels like from the inside, because I think you already know, and I think part of what's making it unbearable is that you feel completely alone in it. It usually starts quietly. The things that used to give your life its shape stop delivering. The work that once felt meaningful feels like going through motions. The relationships that used to fill you leave you strangely empty afterward, like you've eaten a full meal and stayed hungry. You catch yourself in the middle of an ordinary day feeling a kind of vertigo, a sense that you're watching your own life from somewhere slightly outside it, and what you see doesn't quite make sense anymore. Then it deepens. You start to feel like you don't know who you are. And I don't mean that in the poetic self-help sense of finding yourself. I mean the genuinely frightening version, where the identity you've worn for decades stops fitting, and nothing has come to replace it. You look at the choices you've made, the person you've become, the life you've assembled, and instead of recognition, you feel a stranger's confusion. Who built all this? Why does none of it feel like mine? And underneath that, if it goes far enough, comes the real terror, the sense that you're falling and there's no bottom, that you've stepped off the edge of everything solid, and there's nothing to catch you. Jung's patients described this to him in 100 different ways, but the essence was always the same. They felt like they were disappearing, like the person they'd always been was dissolving, and they had no idea what, if anything, would be left when the dissolving stopped. Now here's where almost everyone gets it wrong, and where Jung's insight becomes something you can actually use. When you're inside this experience, every instinct you have interprets it as a catastrophe. Your mind reaches for explanations, and all the explanations it finds are terrifying. I'm depressed. I'm having a breakdown. I've ruined my life. I've made a terrible mistake somewhere, and now I'm paying for it. Something is fundamentally wrong with me. Jung looked at this same experience in patient after patient and saw something the patients themselves could not see from inside it. He saw that the dissolution wasn't a malfunction, it was a process, a necessary, structured, almost predictable process that the psyche moves through whenever it's preparing to reorganize a person's entire life at a level deeper than conscious will could ever reach. He borrowed an image for it from ancient mythology, the night sea journey. In the old stories, the sun god doesn't simply set in the west and rise in the east. At nightfall, he's swallowed by a great sea monster, dragged down beneath the water into darkness, and carried through the belly of the underworld all night long. He has to travel through the dark to reach the dawn. There's no version where the sun skips the night and just stays up. The descent into darkness is built into the structure of how light returns. Jung recognized this pattern operating inside real human beings over and over. Before a person could emerge into a genuinely new way of living, they had to be swallowed. They had to descend into a period of darkness where the old light of their conscious identity went out. And this wasn't punishment, and it wasn't failure. It was the shape transformation actually takes when it's real. Think about what happens when you try to renovate an old house that was built wrong from the start. You can paint the walls, you can rearrange the furniture, you can add new rooms. But if the foundation is cracked, if the whole structure is subtly out of true, then every improvement you make on the surface is just decorating a building that's slowly failing. At some point, if you want a house that will actually hold, you have to open up the walls. You have to expose the wiring. And for a stretch of time, the house becomes uninhabitable, worse in every visible way than it was before you started. Anyone walking past would say you destroyed a perfectly good home. But you didn't destroy it. You opened it up because it needed to be rebuilt from a level that couldn't be reached without tearing into the walls. The terrifying phase is the psyche opening up its own walls, and it feels like destruction because, in a real sense, something is being destroyed. What's being destroyed is the version of you that was built to survive rather than to live. But your nervous system doesn't know the difference. To your nervous system, the loss of an identity, even a false one, even a suffocating one, registers as a threat to survival. That's why it feels like dying. Because to the part of you that built the old identity, it genuinely is. Jung didn't arrive at these ideas from a safe distance. He earned them in the hardest way a person can. And I think it's worth staying with his own experience for a moment, because it changes how you hold your own. In 1913, Jung was at the peak of everything a man of his era was supposed to want. He had an international reputation. He'd been the anointed heir to Freud, the golden son of the entire psychoanalytic movement. He had a family, a home on a lake, financial security, professional prestige. By every external measure, his life was a triumph. And then his break with Freud, combined with something much deeper and harder to name, opened a door inside him that he could not close. He began to feel a pressure he couldn't explain, a disorientation, a sense of the ground giving way. He described feeling as though he was under constant inner pressure, as though something enormous was building beneath the surface of his mind. He started experiencing waking visions, overwhelming, terrifying images of catastrophe and flood and death. He heard voices that seemed to come from somewhere other than his own thinking. For a man who had built his entire life on the rational analysis of the mind, this was the most frightening thing imaginable. He wrote later that he was constantly asking himself whether he was, in his own words, menaced by a psychosis, whether he was simply going mad. And here's the part that matters most for you. Jung made a choice that almost no one makes. Instead of fighting the descent, instead of medicating it away or forcing himself back into his old rational identity, he decided to let himself drop. He chose, deliberately, to stop resisting the fall. He wrote that he made a conscious decision to let himself plummet, to descend into the dark, to stop clutching at the edges. He gave up the fight to hold his old self together and let the process take him down into whatever was waiting. What he found down there wasn't madness. It was the raw material of the second half of his life. Every major idea he became known for, the archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, the whole map of the psyche that made him one of the most influential thinkers of the modern age, came out of that descent. The years that looked, from the outside, like the collapse of a promising career were the years that produced everything that made him Jung. He called this period his confrontation with the unconscious, and he was unflinchingly honest, decades later, about what it cost him. He said it was the most difficult period of his life, that he was frequently on the edge, that only his family and his work anchored him to ordinary reality, while the rest of him was submerged in the dark. But he also said something else. He said that everything he accomplished afterward was already contained in those years, that the terrifying descent wasn't the interruption of his real work, it was the source of it. I want you to hold that, because it reframes the whole thing. The man who understood the human psyche better than almost anyone once stood exactly where you might be standing right now, convinced he was falling apart, unable to explain to anyone what was happening, watching his old certainties dissolve. And that stretch of apparent ruin turned out to be the most generative period of his entire existence. Not despite the darkness, because of what the darkness forced up to the surface. So let's go deeper into the mechanism, because understanding what's actually happening inside you during this phase is what makes it survivable. This is the part that turns the terror from a formless dread into something you can at least begin to work with. The version of you that carried you through the first part of your life was built for a specific purpose. Its purpose was adaptation. From the moment you were born, you were learning what the world around you rewarded and what it punished, what earned you love and what earned you rejection, which parts of yourself were welcome and which parts had to be hidden away. And slowly, without ever deciding to, you assembled a self designed to secure the things you needed and avoid the things that threatened you. Jung called the outward-facing part of this structure the persona, the mask you show the world, shaped by everyone's expectations of who you should be. But it goes deeper than a mask. The entire architecture of your ordinary identity, your goals, your values, your sense of what your life is for, much of it was constructed early, under pressure, by a young mind doing its best to stay safe in circumstances it didn't choose. And that architecture works. It gets you through school, through careers, through relationships. It's genuinely useful, for a while. But here's what Jung understood that most people never grasp. The self that's built for survival is not the same as the self that's built for wholeness. The survival self is defensive by design. It's organized around avoiding pain, securing approval, and maintaining control. And a life organized entirely around those things slowly becomes a very small room. You can decorate it beautifully. You can fill it with achievements and relationships and comforts. But at some point, if there's anything alive in you, that room starts to feel like a cell. And the vitality you've been suppressing your whole life, the parts of yourself you exiled to keep the peace, starts pushing against the walls. The terrifying phase begins when the pressure of everything you've suppressed finally exceeds the strength of the structure holding it down. The psyche has been patient. It has waited, sometimes for decades, while you built your careful life on top of a self you never fully became. And then, something gives. Maybe an external event cracks it open, a loss, a betrayal, an ending. Or maybe nothing external happens at all and you simply wake up one morning and the whole edifice has quietly lost its meaning. Either way, the descent begins. And what's descending is your center of gravity, dropping from the survival self towards something deeper that Jung called the self. The total, whole personality that includes everything the survival self spent your whole life excluding. This is why the phase is so frightening in such a particular way. You're not just losing your job or your relationship or your certainty. You're losing the very mechanism you've used your entire life to feel safe. The survival self is being decentered, and it doesn't go quietly, because from its point of view, it's being murdered. Every alarm bell it has is ringing. Every instinct is screaming at you to reconstruct the old identity as fast as possible, to grab any handhold, to make the falling stop. And the falling feels like proof that something has gone catastrophically wrong, precisely because the part of you generating the alarm is the part that's dissolving. Before we go further into the specific terrors this phase produces, and there are specific ones, each with its own message, I want to name something directly, in case you're living inside this right now. If you're in the descent, and you're looking for a way to work with it rather than just white-knuckle your way through, we put together a guide called True Self-Discovery. It's 24 reflection exercises built directly from Jung's approach to exactly this kind of passage: the night sea journey, the descent, the confrontation with what's rising up from underneath. It's not designed to rush you toward the dawn or talk you out of the dark. It's designed to help you hear what the darkness is actually saying, so you can move through it instead of getting stranded at the edge. The link is right below this video. Now let me show you the specific shape the terror takes, because I think naming it will loosen its grip. The first terror is the fear that you're losing your mind. This is almost universal in genuine descent, and Jung felt it himself as acutely as anyone. When the old identity starts dissolving, your inner experience becomes strange and unpredictable in ways it never was before. Emotions surge up from nowhere. You cry without a clear reason, or feel rage that seems disproportionate to anything happening in your life, or drift through days in a fog that no amount of coffee or willpower can burn off. Your dreams intensify, sometimes to the point of being disturbing. Old memories surface that you haven't thought about in years, and your mind, trying to make sense of all this, reaches the most frightening conclusion available. I'm not okay. Something is seriously wrong with me. What Jung understood is that this influx isn't insanity. It's the unconscious finally getting a hearing. For your entire life, there's been a whole territory inside you that the survival self kept locked away. Feelings you weren't allowed to feel, parts of yourself you learned to reject, truths about your own life you couldn't afford to look at. That material didn't disappear. It went underground and waited. And when the old identity weakens enough, all of it starts rising toward the surface, because the pressure that held it down has finally eased. What feels like your mind fracturing is actually your mind becoming more complete, the exiled material coming home. It's overwhelming because there's so much of it, and because it's been compressed for so long that it arrives with tremendous force. The second terror is the collapse of meaning. This one is quieter than the first, but in some ways harder to bear. You wake up one day, and the things you cared about don't seem to matter anymore. The goals that drove you look arbitrary. The achievements you were proud of feel hollow. The future you'd been building toward stops pulling at you, and nothing new appears to take its place. You're not just sad, you're unmoored, drifting in a life that has lost its narrative, unable to remember why any of it was supposed to be important. People experiencing this often panic and assume they've become depressed, and sometimes there's real depression involved. But Jung saw something underneath it that's easy to miss. When meaning collapses across the board like this, it's often because the meaning you were living by was borrowed. It was inherited from your parents, absorbed from your culture, constructed out of other people's definitions of a life well lived. And the psyche, in its descent, is withdrawing its energy from all of that borrowed meaning because it can no longer sustain the pretense that it was ever really yours. The emptiness isn't the absence of all meaning, it's the clearing away of false meaning, and it feels like nothing because the true meaning, the kind that would actually be yours, hasn't been discovered yet. You're standing in the cleared ground before anything has been planted, and cleared ground looks exactly like wasteland if you don't know what it's for. The third terror is isolation, the sense that no one understands what's happening to you, and no one can follow you where you're going. This one has a cruel edge to it, because it's often confirmed by the actual reactions of the people around you. When you start dissolving your old identity, the people who knew that identity get confused, then concerned, then sometimes frightened or angry. They see you pulling away, going quiet, losing interest in the things you used to share, and they interpret it through the only frame they have. Something's wrong with you, and you need to get back to normal. The descent is a fundamentally solitary passage. Jung was clear about this. During his own confrontation with the unconscious, he withdrew significantly from the world, and he was misunderstood and dismissed by colleagues who could only see a brilliant man falling apart. There's a loneliness in this phase that isn't chosen and doesn't feel noble. It comes from the simple fact that you're moving through territory the people around you haven't crossed, using a map they can't read. And you're pulling towards solitude anyway, because the internal work requires enormous energy, and every social performance drains energy the psyche desperately needs for the rebuilding happening underneath. The withdrawal that looks like isolation from the outside is actually the psyche conserving its resources for the transformation it's undertaking. Now, here's the turn, and it's the most important thing I'll say. Each of these terrors is not just an obstacle to endure. Each one is a message, and when you learn to read them, the descent stops being a random catastrophe and starts revealing itself as a process with a logic. The fear of losing your mind is telling you that the parts of yourself you exiled are coming home, and that you're being asked to make room for a larger self than the one you've been living as. The collapse of meaning is telling you that you've been living by a borrowed script, and that the script has finally run out, clearing the way for you to find out what your life is actually for. And the isolation is telling you that you're moving somewhere the old relationships can't follow, which is painful, but which is also the precondition for discovering the connections that could meet the real you, the ones that couldn't form while you were still performing the false one. This is what Jung meant when he insisted that the descent wasn't pathology. He wasn't dismissing the suffering. He knew the suffering was real and severe. He was saying that the suffering had a direction, a purpose, a shape, that it was labor rather than mere damage, the way birth is labor, excruciating, frightening, involving real risk, and yet oriented entirely toward bringing something new into the world. Let me make this concrete, because the abstraction can only take you so far, and I want you to be able to feel it. Picture someone who spent 20 years becoming exactly who everyone told them to be. Good student, then good professional, climbing steadily, checking every box. They chose the sensible career their family respected. They married the person who made sense on paper. They built a life that photographs beautifully. And for 2 decades, the machinery ran smoothly enough that they never had to ask whether any of it was actually theirs. Then, somewhere in their 40s, it starts. A restlessness they can't locate. A flatness at the center of days that should feel full. They lie awake at 3 in the morning with a weight on their chest and no name for it, because on paper, nothing is wrong. They try the usual repairs, a new project, a vacation, therapy aimed at getting them back to functioning. Each repair buys a few weeks of relief before the flatness seeps back in, a little deeper each time. And then, one day, the machinery just stops. The marriage that had been quietly dying finally ends, or the career that had been slowly suffocating them becomes unbearable, and they find themselves standing in the wreckage of a life they spent 20 years building, with no idea who they are without it. From the outside, everyone sees the same thing. Poor them, their life fell apart. Midlife crisis, breakdown. And that person, lying awake now for entirely different reasons, is terrified. Because every story they have access to tells them they've failed. They wasted their best years. They ruined a perfectly good life. They're too old to start over, and too lost to even know what starting over would mean. But Jung, looking at this same person, would see something no one else in the room can see. He'd see a psyche that finally gathered enough force to break through a false structure. He'd see 20 years of suppressed vitality finally overwhelming the walls that held it down. He'd see someone standing not at the end of their life, but at the true beginning of it. In the dark, yes. In the belly of the whale, yes. But for the first time, close enough to their own depths to actually build a life that fits. Everything that looks like ruin is the opening of the walls. The house is being rebuilt from the foundation, and for now, it's uninhabitable. And that uninhabitability is precisely the evidence that the real work has finally begun. The tragedy Jung watched again and again wasn't the descent itself, it was the flight from the descent. Because most people, when they reach this point, cannot tolerate it. And I understand why. The terror is genuine. The uncertainty is unbearable. The pull to make it stop is one of the strongest forces the human psyche can generate. So, they turn back. They reconstruct the old identity as fast as they can. They call the X. They recommit to the career they were dying inside of. They rebuild the persona they'd finally started shedding, glue the mask back onto their face, and return to the life that was suffocating them because at least suffocation is familiar. And it works, in a way. From the outside, it looks like recovery. They weathered the storm. They pulled themselves together. But Jung knew what it actually was. It was a retreat from the threshold of transformation. And the people who make that retreat carry a specific ache for the rest of their lives. A quiet, persistent sense that there was a version of themselves they almost became. A life that was trying to be born, and they turned away from it at the last moment because the darkness got too deep. Here's what makes the flight so seductive. And I want to be honest about this because pretending it's easy to resist would be a lie. The descent gives you nothing to hold on to. That's its entire nature. The old identity is gone or going, and the new one hasn't arrived, and in between there's a gap, a genuine void where you have no clear sense of who you are, what you want, or where you're going. And the human mind is not built to tolerate that void gracefully. Every survival instinct you have interprets the void as danger and demands that you fill it immediately with anything, any identity, any plan, any relationship, any story, just to make the free fall stop. Jung saw this gap as the crux of the entire process. Everything depended on whether a person could stay in it long enough. Not forever, just long enough for something real to form. Because the void isn't empty in the way it feels empty. It's more like the darkness of soil than the darkness of a tomb. Something is happening down there, out of sight, at a pace that can't be rushed. And if you can resist the desperate urge to fill the gap prematurely, if you can tolerate not knowing who you are for longer than feels bearable, something begins to take shape that could never have been engineered by conscious effort. A new center, a truer identity, a way of living that emerges from your actual depths rather than from your fears. He described the psyche's capacity to bridge this gap as a kind of function that only activates under sustained tension. When you can hold two opposite states at once, when you can feel utterly lost and still somehow trust the process, when you can grieve what's dying while staying open to what's being born, something new gets generated that neither your conscious mind nor your unconscious could have produced alone. A third thing, a resolution that wasn't available before, that transcends the terms of the old conflict entirely. But that function only works if you stay in the tension. Collapse back into the old identity, and you've resolved the tension falsely. Leap prematurely into a new one, and you've skipped the transformation. The whole thing depends on your willingness to stand in the fire of not knowing, while something real assembles itself in the dark. And this brings us to the deepest layer of what this phase actually is, because there's a reason the terror is so specifically, precisely terrifying, a reason it targets exactly the things it targets. The descent isn't random destruction. It dismantles your identity along the specific fault lines where that identity was false. Think about that carefully. The parts of your life that fall away during this phase aren't chosen arbitrarily. They're the parts that were built on something untrue, the relationship that was maintained through performance, the career that violated your actual values, the beliefs about yourself that you absorbed instead of choosing. The descent is intelligent. It knows exactly what to take apart because it's taking apart everything that isn't load-bearing for the real self that's trying to emerge. This is why the terror feels so personal, so aimed. It's aimed. The parts of you that panic during the descent are the false parts, the survival structures, and they panic precisely because they can sense that they're the ones being dissolved. What feels like your whole self screaming in fear is actually the part of you that was never really you, fighting for its continued existence. And underneath that screaming, quieter, harder to hear, there's something else. Something that isn't afraid at all. Something that has been waiting your entire life for exactly this, for the walls to finally come down so it can breathe. Jung watched what happened to the people who could stay in the dark long enough for their eyes to adjust, and he noticed something that his more rational colleagues found almost impossible to accept because it sounded mystical when it was actually a psychological mechanism. The people who descended most completely often emerged into the most complete transformations. The period of deepest isolation frequently preceded the arrival of the most genuine relationships of their lives. The moment of most total meaninglessness often gave birth to a sense of purpose more powerful than anything they'd known. The tendency of things, at their extreme, to turn into their opposite. The mechanism behind it is this: as long as the survival self is running your life, the deeper intelligence of the psyche, the part that actually knows who you are and what would genuinely fulfill you, can't get through. It's been shouting into a room where nobody's listening because the survival self is too busy managing appearances and avoiding threats to hear anything real. But when the descent exhausts the survival self, when all its plans and defenses and strategies finally run out of fuel, a space opens up. And into that space, the deeper self can finally speak. It knows things about you that your conscious mind has been too busy performing to notice. It knows what actually moves you, what kind of work would feel like breathing, what kind of love you're actually capable of. It simply couldn't be heard until the noise stopped. The descent is what stops the noise. So the breakthrough, when it comes, almost never looks like what the old self would have chosen. That's how you know it's real. The person who spent 20 years climbing a ladder might find themselves drawn towards something that pays less and means more. The person who performed strength and invulnerability their whole life might discover that their real power lives in the vulnerability they spent decades hiding. The person who exhausted themselves trying to earn love might find, in the emptiness at the bottom of the descent, that they're capable of generating it from within, and that discovery reorganizes every relationship they'll ever have. The breakthrough isn't the old life restored and improved. It's a different life entirely, built from a different center, because the descent changed where you live inside yourself. I want to say something now to whoever is actually in this right now, because I think that's who this is really for. If you're in the dark, if the ground has dropped out, if you can't see a single reason to believe things will ever feel solid again, I'm not going to tell you it isn't as bad as it feels. Jung never told his patients that, because it would have been a lie, and they'd have known it. It is as bad as it feels. The descent is one of the hardest things a human being can pass through. But I am going to tell you what Jung told the people who sat across from him in exactly your state, because it's the truth, and because it might be the thing that keeps you from turning back. You are not falling apart, you are falling in. And the reason it feels like coming apart is that you've spent your whole life fused to a self that was never fully yours, and its dissolution feels like the loss of everything because you never learned to tell the difference between that self and the deeper one underneath it. But there is a deeper one. There always was. And the darkness you're standing in isn't the absence of the light. It's the place where your eyes are adjusting so you can finally see it. Consider what it means that this is happening to you at all. Jung believed, and he staked his life's work on this, that the psyche doesn't initiate a descent in someone who can't survive it. The dissolution wouldn't be happening if you didn't already possess, somewhere in you, the resources to withstand it and rebuild on the other side. Your unconscious doesn't tear down structures it isn't prepared to replace. So the very thing that feels like evidence that you're too weak, too broken, too lost, the fact that this is happening to you at all, is actually evidence of the opposite. Something in you is strong enough to rebuild from the foundation, and it knows this even when the rest of you doesn't. The demolition itself is the proof of your capacity to survive it. This is worth sitting with, because it inverts everything the terror is telling you. The terror says, you're too fragile for this, you have to stop it, you have to get back to safety. But the presence of the descent says, you're strong enough now, finally, to face what you've been avoiding your whole life, and some deep part of you decided the time had come. The breakdown is a vote of confidence from the part of you that knows you best. And here's something else Jung understood about the timing of all this. The descent tends to come not when you're weakest, but when you've finally accumulated enough strength to survive the truth. All those years you spent building the survival self, all that effort, all that careful adaptation, it wasn't wasted. It was necessary. You needed that structure to get you through the parts of your life when you weren't yet ready to face what was underneath it. The survival self was scaffolding, and scaffolding is essential right up until the moment it becomes the thing preventing the building from being finished. The descent arrives when the scaffolding has done its job and the real structure is finally ready to stand on its own. It feels like ruin because scaffolding coming down always looks like ruin to anyone who mistook the scaffolding for the building. So what does the dawn actually look like on the other side of the night sea journey? Jung's answer surprised even the people closest to his work because he didn't describe it in terms of external circumstances. He didn't promise the marriage would be replaced by a better one or the career by a more lucrative one, though those things often followed. He described an internal shift so fundamental that it changed a person's entire relationship with being alive. He described people who developed, after the descent, a felt sense of being rooted in something deeper than their circumstances, a center of gravity that couldn't be knocked over by loss or rejection or the opinions of others because it no longer depended on any of those things. They'd been to the bottom. They'd lost their identity entirely and survived. And having survived the ultimate uncertainty of not knowing who they were, ordinary uncertainty lost most of its power over them. They could tolerate not knowing what came next because they'd learned in the descent that not knowing wasn't fatal. They could be alone without being lonely because they'd discovered in the isolation that the companionship they'd been chasing from others was available from within. These people moved through the world differently. They made decisions from a place of inner alignment rather than external pressure. They could hold contradictions without needing to flatten them into simple stories. They stopped living in anticipation, always reaching for the next proof that their life was working, and they stopped living in regret, endlessly reviewing the past for evidence of failure. They became present in a way they'd never been, because the descent had burned away the future they were chasing and the past they were mourning, and left them with the only thing that was ever actually real, which is now. And they carried the darkness with them in a way, not as a wound but as knowledge. They knew the descent could come again, because that's how a genuine life works. Jung never taught that you go through the night sea journey once and then live forever in the daylight. He taught that transformation is a lifelong spiral, that you descend and rise and descend again, each time deeper, each time bringing more of yourself into the light. But once you've made the crossing consciously even one time, everything changes. Because the next time the darkness comes, you recognize it. You know what it is. You know that the terror is labor, and the dissolution is intelligent, and the void is fertile, and you stop fighting the fall. You let yourself drop, the way Jung did, because you've learned that the bottom of the descent is where the real life begins. If you're standing in that dark room right now, waiting for your eyes to adjust, I want to leave you with the thing that matters most. Your only job in this phase is to keep standing, to resist the pull back toward what's familiar but finished, to tolerate the not knowing for one more day, and then one more after that. You don't have to figure out who you're becoming. You couldn't force that even if you tried, because it's forming in the dark, at a pace that isn't yours to set. All you have to do is refuse to flee, stay in the room, let the old story end, and trust that the emptiness you feel isn't the absence of a life, but the space where a life that's actually yours is quietly, slowly, out of sight, gathering the strength to begin. If any of this is landing because you're living it, if you recognized yourself in the descent, in the void, in the terror that turns out to have a shape, then the work of staying in the dark long enough is easier with something to hold. That's what we built true self-discovery for. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's map of exactly this passage, designed to help you listen to what's rising up from underneath instead of drowning it out, so you can move through the descent consciously the way Jung learned to, rather than white-knuckling your way past the very thing that came to transform you. The link is right below this video.